Welcome to episode 297 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourScreenplay.com. Today I'm interviewing writer-director duo Scott Beck and Bryan Woods. They wrote the hugely successful film A Quiet Place, which is available right now through Amazon Prime if you haven't already seen it. Bryan and Scott are back with a new film called Haunt. So we dig into that film, how that came about, as well as talking specifically about A Quiet Place and how that project came about as well. So stay tuned for that interview. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking or sharing it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcast, and then just look for episode number 297. If you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide. I'll teach you how to write a professional logline and query letter and how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. Really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I am interviewing writer-director duo Scott Beck and Bryan Woods. Here is the interview. Welcome, Bryan and Scott, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you guys coming on the show with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us. Thanks for having us.
So to start out, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up and how did you get interested in the business? And maybe to start, Scott, you can go first and then Bryan will get you second.
Absolutely. So Bryan and I, we've actually known each other since we were 11 years old. We both met in the same town of Bettendorf, Iowa, sitting at the same lunch table, and we quickly discovered both of us had a love of movies and a love of making movies with our action figures, just like stop motion films. And so in middle school and then in high school, that's where we really started taking the craft seriously. And we would write our own screenplays. We would produce them for no budget with our friends or local actors, and then we would screen those on like the local IMAX screens and hand out scorecards and try to get a gauge of what was working about the movie, but more importantly, what wasn't working about the movie, and then steamroll that into the next project that we were then writing and making.
Yeah, and it kind of just went,
And so how old were you? How old were you guys when you were doing this? Getting a film onto an IMAX screen seems something a lot more advanced than an 11-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, we were young. I mean, probably middle school and high school. Teenage.
Huh.
We had probably made at least 5 micro budget features before we got to college, and then in college we would do more micro budget, very very kind of small in scope feature films, and in college just casting local actors. And we're from Iowa, so friendly, and film is so exciting, and there's so many talented people who weren't able to work in film because there's no film business in Iowa, obviously. So we were the beneficiaries of groundswell of amazing talent and support. And our career kind of just progressed from there. We eventually moved out to Los Angeles and hit the ground running, writing spec after spec, and just kind of falling on our faces and getting back into it and just doing the best we could. We probably wrote close to 30 screenplays before we became professional screenwriters. It took a very long time to get there.
Yeah. And I think that's so interesting that you guys say that, because I think, with A Quiet Place being such a big hit, I think everybody's going to look at that and wonder sort of what is the groundwork. And I think it's so interesting just to hear that you guys were just slugging away for years and years and years, ultimately to get to that place. Do you feel like there was a tipping point in your career? So you're making all these shorts, you're making these micro budget features. Was there a tipping point where all of a sudden you rounded a corner and you thought, okay, we can actually make a living at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two tipping, to be honest. Like, there was one point that is what we consider steeped in failure, which was we were maybe a few years out of college, we were lucky enough through entertainment attorney friend to get a meeting at a few big agencies like CAA and ICM and Gersh, and we had lined up. We had a few screenplays that we had the meeting, and it was fantastic. And they were like, "Oh, you're going to be the next big thing," and like everything that you typically think a Hollywood agent is going to say, they said. And we were young enough that we were like, "Oh, maybe we finally will get signed." We sent over like the screenplays. Way too ambitious, like movies that were, budgeted at $200 million. And we got turned down at every corner. And that same week, we had scripts that were sent out to the Sundance Screenwriters Lab for consideration, the Nichols Fellowship, to other places. And also in that same week, we got rejected from them. And it was a turning point. What we need to do is we need to write something that we could produce in our own backyard. And that rearranged our thinking of how to approach story. And very much that carries through to this very day. It certainly was a lesson that we applied to our upcoming film Haunt. It applied to Quiet Place, where there's a version of Quiet Place that back in Iowa, and we could make the lower budget version of that movie. So it's just writing with that in mind. I think beyond that, certainly A Quiet Place was a big tipping point for us, even though we had been working for a few years as professionals, writing scripts, a couple that had sold, a few assignments that we did for film and television. What A Quiet Place did was it, to a certain degree, validated our passion projects, things that on the page may seem like really crazy off-the-wall ideas. On the page, we would be able to find a home for it and put original filmmaking, hopefully, back into theaters outside of the franchise films that we see, every weekend that come out.
Yeah. And I want to get into Haunt, but just one more question about A Quiet Place, because I know people will be interested in this. Can you talk just a little bit about your process of coming up with that high concept idea? I think every screenwriter just would love to find that, great idea. And A Quiet Place is such a good example. There's a bunch of knockoffs. We're probably going to see, countless sequels. How did you guys come up with that high concept idea? Were you sitting around and just, you came up with it one day? Were you just generating lots of ideas and this was the best of the many ideas? Maybe just talk through just briefly that process of coming up with that high concept idea for A Quiet Place.
Of course. A Quiet Place was essentially one idea of 100 ideas that we had stowed away in a journal. So we came up with, we knew in college, we were watching a lot of silent film and really getting kind of like falling in love with Charlie Chaplin and Jacques Tati, this French filmmaker, and just filmmakers who are making silent film after sound had already kind of been invented and been a part of cinema for a while. In other words, they were silent films that were mostly visual, but still had music and sync sound. You could have dialogue if you wanted to. And so we thought it would be really cool to marry modern day film that's set in the horror genre, because sound for us is a tool that a horror filmmaker has in their toolbox. There's no better way to create suspense or scares than sound design. So we were like, well, what if we could make sound the shark from Jaws? Like, how could we? Scary. And so we came up with what you would consider the gimmick of the idea. Like, if you make a sound, you die. But we put it in a drawer because we felt like it was just a gimmick, and it wasn't until years later we were working on a few assignments and different things for work, and we kind of pulled that idea back out of the drawer, and we thought, what is the story? Like, this is just, it's a cool idea, but like what is the story? What can it be about? And that's when we really started thinking about, what if it was about a family who's lost a family member that's tragically died, and they are fractured and they're not able to talk to each other. They have this breakdown of communication. And even if they were living in a world that didn't have aliens invading that attack by, still wouldn't be talking to each other. And it was as soon as we figured that out, that the whole story was going to drive towards the father telling his children that he loves them, that it was all driving towards that. That's when we were like, eureka. Now we have the story, we have a script. That's a script that can be written. So it took a while. I
gotcha. Yeah. So perfect. Well, thank you for that. So let's dig into Haunt. Maybe to start out, you can just give us a quick pitch or logline. What is Haunt all about?
Yeah, so Haunt essentially follows Harper, our protagonist, who is dealing with an abusive relationship, and it all comes to a head on Halloween night. And to kind of shoulder off all of that stress, she goes out with some of her friends for a night of haunted housing. And where they end up is actually an extreme haunted house attraction where the lines become very blurred about. And they soon learn that everything that's happening there is 100% real and
I got you. And let's talk through the process of this idea. How did this idea come about? What was the genesis for this idea?
Well, going to haunted houses over the Halloween season, like you'd go in Iowa. It's not like what people think of when they think of like Fright Fest or Halloween Horror Nights at these amusement parks where it's like kind of and all the kind of haunts are the same. Like in Iowa, like you drive out into the middle of nowhere, in this like abandoned factory or like a dilapidated church in the middle of the woods, and it's run by people whose hobby it is. Like that's what they're there for. And we just started thinking, wow, you're really vulnerable when you're in that position. And our producer Todd Garner, he had wanted to. It was something he was knocking around, and he kind of brought us in and was like, "You guys have any ideas? Like, do you, like total free reign? I would love some villains, that are really sharp and original and interesting, and I'd love this kind of, do whatever you want if you're interested." And it just really got our imaginations going, and just kind of drawing upon our childhood and our love of horror. And we talk a lot about how we were writing A Quiet Place and Haunt at the same time. And it was, when we were talking about it like a prestige film. We were talking about it like, like it'd be, like we really want to elevate the horror genre. And then at the same time, we're kind of rolling our eyes at ourselves and scoffing and going, well, like as horror fans, like you don't need to elevate the horror genre. The horror genre is great the way it is. And so us chasing those kind of 80s and 70s slashers of, John Carpenter or Tobe Hooper, and really kind of rolling around in those other elements. It's kind of two sides of our love of horror, really, writing those movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about collaboration with you guys. And maybe you can kind of just describe how your collaboration works. Are you guys in the same room, different rooms? Do you guys outline together and then divide up scenes and then critique each other's scenes? What does that process look like of actual collaboration?
So, like, from the genesis of a project, outside of kicking around just a bunch of different ideas, once we hone in on something, Bryan and I usually sit in the same room and we just brainstorm about, this could be cool, this could be a great set piece, this is what the character arc should really be. And then we kind of go off into separate rooms and we start writing it. We do, like, I wouldn't say a traditional outline. We keep notes and notes and notes about what the story really might be and what it becomes, but we want to give ourselves enough bandwidth that when we're writing it, we're not completely regimented to a single outline. Certainly in writing Quiet Place and to an even greater degree in writing Haunt, there's times, when we're on page 50 and we have a loose idea of where we're going to go, but we get a great idea and then we end up following that down a different trajectory entirely, and it changes the shape of the film, but hopefully it keeps it exciting. Movies as an audience member, and we're just sitting back watching the pages kind of unfurl and hopefully surprise ourselves throughout that process too. But yeah, we end up writing in separate rooms. So Bryan will do like a pass of 10 to 15 pages. He'll send it over to me. Then I will do, a rewrite of that and then pass it back after adding other pages. And it kind of goes back and forth till we have a full completed draft.
I see. And just what kind of tools are you guys using? Are you using do you outline in Google Docs so you guys both have access to it? What are the actual tools?
Yeah.
How are you actually writing the screenplay? You just final draft?
By all means necessary. So we have note journals. We have, sometimes we use Yellow Legal Pad. We use Microsoft Word. We definitely use Google Docs when it's kind of assess together and need to edit and revise together. And then we write in final draft in script form. So all over the map. ourselves into writing and get ourselves excited. And so sometimes it's fun to write digitally with a keyboard on a computer. Sometimes it's fun to write longhand with a pen or.
I see. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the outlining stage. You mentioned that you guys would sit in the same room and kind of kick around ideas. How much time do you spend in that outlining stage versus how much time do you spend actually in final draft writing the pages?
So in the outline, outside of like writing a traditional outline, it is a lot about culminating notes. So we may be working on an entirely different project. Idea for a character sketch starts us, and we write that down either in the draft inbox of our email or on a notepad. And we just start collecting these ideas. We're very adamant about the whole idea when you're not writing, meaning you're not just sitting at a laptop, but you're just living life, and you have your antennas out to be struck by inspiration at any point, and then you write that down, and hopefully over like weeks or months you're starting to collect enough ideas that then we can sit in the same room and really talk about what the story is. Process. We probably spend less time on it than some other traditional writers. What we really love doing is figuring out what that first act is, like what's really the entry point to the story, characters, what's the conceit, and what really is an inciting incident. And then from there, we have a loose idea of what Act 2 is. And Act 3, we usually need some runway to land on, meaning like in A Quiet Place, we always knew where that story was going to end up in terms of how it culminates with the father and the ultimate choice that he makes and where that leaves the family. But in the middle, we love leaving a little bit of room for discovery. So we're not as hard on ourselves as outlining all of that up front versus trying to discover a little bit of that on the page.
I gotcha. Let's talk about your development process just quickly. So you eventually have a first draft. Then what does that next step look like? You mentioned that you had a producer in the case of Haunt that sort of suggested some loose ideas. Do you send it to him, get notes, and how do you ultimately take those notes?
Yeah, it's slightly different every time, but I mean, we really incubate. When we write, a first draft from us is like a 12th draft because we're so rigorous with our own development process, and we're really insular. Like we have readers that we've trusted for years and years and years. I mean, our close readers were the ones who knew A Quiet Place was, a terrific idea and script before anyone else. Like when people didn't believe in the pitch or the idea of A Quiet Place, like our trusted readers of collaborators and filmmakers and friends and family were the ones to really support us. And so our process is always sharing with them, developing. We have a manager that we've been with forever at Anonymous Content who we love to bring in and get his feedback and develop. And then from there, yeah, like when you work with producers, especially on a big studio movie, like oftentimes you're going to the producers in the studio, and that can go great and it can go bad. On A Quiet Place, it was really terrific because our producers were fairly hands-off on the script and really trusted and believed in the idea. Now, as a studio, their notes are really terrific. Some of them were things that we weren't as interested in, but a lot of them were things about kind of developing character and embracing the family dynamic and digging in deeper, and that was a terrific experience, which isn't always the case.
How do you guys negotiate issues when the two of you disagree? How do you get past those blocks? There must be moments where you think one thing, he thinks another thing.
Yeah, there are. Luckily, they are very rare circumstances that ever happens, but usually what happens is if Bryan presents an idea and I'm really stubborn and I don't think that's the right path forward, we both take the night and we think on it. And what happens is that the next morning we come to the table and I'm like, oh, Bryan, actually, I've thought about it. Your idea I actually love. We can make it work this way. And then Bryan comes back at me and he's like, actually, I've gone back on that. And I think you were right about not doing it and not implementing that idea. So we end up flip-flopping But what that means is, like, we try to approach everything so free of ego, where it's not about one person's idea being better than the other. It's just really what's best for the story and what's going to get us in the best shape possible. Mm-hmm. And so again, it happens rare, but in those circumstances, it always has a different outcome. But I think whoever feels the most passionate, usually we're willing to kind of trust the other creator and see where things go.
I gotcha. How can people see Haunt? Do you know what the release schedule is going to be like?
Yeah, so it comes out in the United States September 13th. It's coming to, I think, about like 10 theaters in all, Los Angeles and New York. But that same day, it'll also be available on that you typically use to watch any films, and it'll be on one in October. Shudder, which is the horror-based genre channel that you can get on any of your platforms. They'll be supporting the release at the very end of October, I believe October 25th.
Okay, perfect. And what's the best way for people to just keep up with what you guys are doing? Twitter, Facebook, blog, anything you're comfortable sharing, I'll put in the show notes.
Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our handle is Beck and Woods, and we post plenty of updates of projects on
and we share lots of screenwriting war stories on our Twitter, so it's a good follow if you're a screenwriter.
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. I will put that in the show notes so people can click over to it. Well, Scott and Bryan, I really appreciate your time. This is a great interview. People will get a lot of value at it. Good luck with this film, and good luck with your future films.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later. A quick plug for the SYS Screenwriting Analysis Service. It's a really economical way to get a high-quality professional evaluation on your screenplay. When you buy our 3-pack, you get evaluations at just $67 per script for feature films and just $55 for teleplays. All the readers have professional experience reading for studios, production companies, contests, and agencies. You can read a short bio on each reader on our website, and you can pick the reader who you think is the best fit for your script. Turnaround time is usually just a few days, but rarely more than a week. The readers will evaluate your script on 6 key factors: concept, character, structure, marketability, tone, and overall craft, which includes formatting, spelling, and grammar. Every script will get a grade of pass, consider, or recommend, which should help you roughly understand where your script might rank if you were to submit it to a production company or agency. We can provide an analysis on features or television scripts. We also do proofreading without any analysis. We will also look at a treatment or outline and give you the same analysis on it. So if you're looking to vet some of your project ideas, this is a great way to do it. We will also write your logline and synopsis for you. You can add this logline and synopsis writing service to an analysis, or you can simply purchase this service as a standalone product. As a bonus, if your screenplay gets a recommend or a consider from one of our readers, you get to list the screenplay in the SYS Select database, which is a database for producers to find screenplays and a big part of our SYS Select program. Producers are in the database searching for material on a daily basis, so it's another great way to get your material in front of them. As a further bonus, if your script gets a recommend from one of our readers, your screenplay will get included in our monthly Best Of newsletter. Each month we send out a newsletter that highlights the best screenplays that have come through our script analysis service. This is a monthly newsletter that goes out to our list of over 400 producers who are actively looking for material. So again, this is another great way to get your material out there. So if you want a professional evaluation of your screenplay at a very reasonable price, check out www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultants. Again, that's sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultants. On the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Joseph Mumba. He's another great example of a filmmaker living outside of Hollywood who's getting his films made. He lives in Arizona, and he just completed another feature film, an action film called Expo. We talk through that film as well as how he's been able to get movies made while not living in Hollywood. So keep an eye out for that episode next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from the interview today with Scott and Bryan. I thought it was very interesting when they said that they had the idea for A Quiet Place and then stuck it in a drawer for a while. Hindsight is always 20/20, and it seems so obvious now what a great idea this is, but it's only obvious because it worked. As an aside, amateurs are always so afraid of someone stealing their great idea, but that's what you have to realize. No idea, even great ones like A Quiet Place, are that easy to identify before they've actually worked. Of course, there's the execution, which is so important, and that's what amateurs tend to underestimate. If you're a fan of the Blake Snyder book, Save the Cat, one of the things that he proposed was just walking into a coffee shop and talking to strangers and just pitching them your movie's ideas. And that's so great just to get that feedback. But again, the most important thing with all of this stuff is the execution. On a practical level, what does this mean as far as getting these ideas, having these ideas, and getting these ideas and executing these ideas? It means, for me anyways, I start with a Google Doc. I has an idea bank. I log all of my ideas and put them into that Google Doc. I never delete anything. And that's the thing. Sometimes then you can go back later with fresh eyes and an idea will look a little bit different. And maybe you'll be able to crack the story element of the idea. And all of a sudden it will start to make sense for you. So as Scott and Bryan described here, they put this thing in a drawer for a year or two, and then they came back and they understood what they had to do in terms of the execution. They knew the idea wasn't worth much until they figured out the broader strokes of the story. Again, really think about that. The idea is not worth nearly as much as you might think without great execution. The actual execution is so important. What's the story beyond the high concept logline? And go back and listen to that section. They knew they had a good idea, but they didn't know how to actually execute the script. So they just put the idea on hold. That's the key. Once they cracked the actual story, then it wasn't just a great idea. It was a great idea written into a well-executed screenplay. And that's what's valuable in Hollywood. The actual idea without the good execution really isn't worth nearly as much as you might think. It's the execution that actually makes these things valuable. And it's not always going to be obvious how to actually execute on a great idea. So doing what they did is just so smart. If you recognize an idea, you recognize something, oh, this might be a good idea, but I don't quite know how to execute it. Again, put it in that idea bank. The reverse, I think, is also true. And again, this is going to amateurs. I mean, these guys are not amateurs. They had been writing for a while. They're obviously very smart, obviously very talented. So they recognized that they had a good idea but didn't know how to execute it. And I find amateurs go the opposite direction. You know, they will have an idea that's not nearly as good as this one. They will think it's as good or better, and then they'll do sloppy execution. And that's the thing. That's obviously never going to work. But even if you are able to come up with a really great idea, if it's not executed well, it's not going to be valuable. There's not going to be too many people want to produce a script where the idea is not executed in a great way. And here's the other thing. It's not like people are going to read that script and say, oh, it's a great, maybe this happens sometimes. They read the thing and they say, well, it's a great idea, but the execution is poor. And so then maybe they would hire another writer to actually go and do a better execution. But I can tell you, for someone who's been around Hollywood for a long time, it's only in hindsight that the idea looks as brilliant as it does. It's because it was in a well-executed screenplay. But beyond that, not only was it a great idea executed into a great screenplay, it was a great idea executed into a great screenplay, then also executed into a great production. That also was a big hit. There, you can mess up at any one of those points. You can have a bad idea. You can have bad execution. You can have a good movie that doesn't. Obviously, you can make a bad movie, and then you can also make a good movie that doesn't actually have commercial success. And unless all those things line up, nobody would have gone back and looked at this idea and said, "Oh, what a brilliant idea." It's apparent to us now because everything lined up. The planets aligned, and this thing worked from top to bottom. But it wouldn't be that obvious if this movie had flopped, or if the execution of the production, maybe the screenplay was really good, but the execution of the production wasn't good. If any of these things had gone off track, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about what a great idea this is. Again, all that to say is just listen to their template for that, how they worked through that idea of a quiet place. I think that's really the best template you can have. Coming up with those great ideas, storing them, keeping them in your idea bank, and then also understanding that the execution is going to be so important. And so not moving forward until you have a good idea, but until you have a great idea with a plan on how to actually execute that idea and pull it out and really make the most of that idea. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.